The Ascent, developed by Neon Giant and published by Curve Digital, had me thinking back to another 2021 release, Biomutant. While that game is not cyberpunk, it doesn't use an isometric viewpoint, and it's not a tactical twin-stick shooter, it shares the Ascent's major failing. Both are games that offer a massive world to explore, but offer far too few compelling things to do within it. Once that core gameplay loop becomes stale, and you find yourself just pushing from one bland mission to the next, even the audiovisual majesty of the Ascent's intricate environments begin to lose their impact and fade into the background. The Ascent places you in the boots of a lightly customizable human indent on the corporate-controlled world of Velis. You're a slave in all but name, bound to the Ascent group by a lengthy contract, tasked with doing jobs that have a good chance of killing you long before you can gain your freedom. During a mission in the Deep Stink, the filthy underbelly of this massive, densely inhabited arcology where you'll spend all your time, the Ascent group goes into default, the board goes quiet, and chaos ensues. The entire arcology becomes a free-for-all. Corporate security disbands, gangs begin fighting over territory, and other corporations send in teams to claim assets. It's a great start that introduces the planet of Velis, a world cohabited by a half-dozen intelligent species, where the powerful corporations are engaged in rampant, often violent capitalism. It's a world in which the life of an individual indent is worth little. The board and their corporate security teams control everything from above, while secondary hierarchies exist among the communities they control. Everyone attempts to exert power within their sphere of interest, just so long as they can avoid the gaze of those above them. Sadly, this great premise often feels underutilized as the narrative moves at a lethargic pace, while subsequent world-building is also handled poorly. The Ascent is one of those games in which little of interest happens until you hit an end mission cutscene. You interact with the quest giver, sit through a one-sided explanation of the situation and what they need. You then fight your way to the conclusion, hoping that the next cutscene advances the story in some meaningful way. Side missions can be quirky, and often reveal the true extent of corporate greed, but they're equally simplistic in structure, and also boil down to running between quest markers. Sure, there are intriguing elements. Why did the Ascent group collapse? What is the mysterious project they were working on? And what are the intentions of the different corporations and factions vying to take control? However, these story beats are dragged out between lengthy, multi-part missions that often have you just running around the world, sometimes in literal circles. The game even alludes to this in some late-game dialogue that was, presumably, meant to be funny. The scale of the missions pick up from around a third of the way through the game, but it always feels like you're just going along for the ride. Your character is a gun for hire, following orders in the hope of more freedom or pay, and the player is never given any agency in how the story plays out. Despite Neon Giant putting a ton of effort in establishing the universe and providing detailed descriptions for every location and character, this information is often hidden away in an increasingly bloated codex, or it requires the player to sit through more NPC monologues. You've got a semi-sentient imp communication device, which occasionally pipes up with some information about a new location, but the bulk of your playtime is spent trudging through large, elaborate areas that serve as nothing more than an incredibly pretty backdrop for increasingly rote gameplay. In densely packed settlements, you'll find no shortage of NPCs to have more one-sided conversations with, or banter between NPCs that you can overhear, but taking in all these is time-consuming, to the point of immersion-breaking. There's one newscaster that recounts some recent events, some quest givers will comment on the amount of collateral damage you cause, and you'll occasionally get a few new, and endlessly repeating, pop-up conversations appearing in towns. Unfortunately, that's as much feedback as you get. The Ascent desperately needed a more organic way of conveying its extensive lore to the player while on the go. When it comes to the gameplay, the Ascent can be engaging and fun, specifically in co-op, local or online, when it finds good balance of exploration and combat. The longer you play, the more frequent the bouts of hyper-violent, tactical twin-stick shooting become. Given most missions task you with delivering something, holding out in a position, or holding a button until a task is complete, you'll come to crave these encounters, and several end-mission bosses, though these bosses are really just tough enemies with supporting minions most of the time. During this tactical combat, you'll also come to appreciate the Ascent gives you far more options than simply moving with the left stick and aiming with the right. There's an active dodge and skills with cooldowns, which is par for the course these days. There's also a hacking tool that can override some turrets, get you vending machines to spew out consumables, or unlock a few secret chests. but the Ascent places the most emphasis on cover and your aiming height. In standard run-and-gun combat, you can switch from aiming from the hip to raising your weapons and aiming down the sight. Aiming carefully slows you down, but decreases bullet spread and increases the chance of scoring critical hits. Crouching allows you to use cover, and raising your weapon in this position will allow you to blind fire from a relatively safe position, with surprisingly minimal loss of accuracy. However, enemies will also make use of cover, and there are several low-profile enemies added to the mix that require you to crouch or hip fire to hit. As battles get tougher and the enemy roster more diverse, think melee rushers, shielded enemies, enemies with jump packs, hackers with turrets, heavy weapon users, grenadiers and snipers, combat can become engaging and enjoyable, but especially if you've got a friend or two to cover all angles and prioritize targets. Different enemy types are susceptible to one of 4 damage types. The game almost always spawns enemies behind you, and there's a down but not out feature that you can use when playing in co-op. In contrast, death in single player often sends you back to a distant checkpoint. When I was playing solo, I found there were several difficulty spikes, and the entire endgame sequence was miserable. I say that having completed all but one side mission, having upped my weapons to Mark 10, equipped all purple gear, and even equipped several support augmentations. Unfortunately, whether you're playing solo or in co-op, you'll eventually come to realize the combat doesn't evolve much over the course of the game. You keep increasing your damage output and damage resistance with each level, while enemies do the same. There were no moments when a new weapon or augmentation caused me to change my tactics. Outside of combat, the Ascent most closely resembles an action RPG. Your character gains levels and puts points into a simple skill tree. Augmentations provide active skills or a passive buff. Your hacking tool can be upgraded with the right collectibles. There's an extensive gear system with rarity tiers and weapons that can be upgraded. Shopkeepers will buy and sell said gear, and there are level-gated areas that have enemies that will often one-shot you if you stray there too early. The leveling and gear systems are not too deep, but they're also streamlined so as not to be intrusive. Weapons have varying stats and damage types, while armor comes in several tiers, offering different resistances and boosts to your skills or attributes. While that may sound like a lot of systems to engage with, the Ascent's vast environments do their best to ensure the bulk of your playtime is spent trudging from point A to B. You move at an infuriatingly slow speed, and the fast travel options, which include elevators, metro stations, and a taxi you can summon almost anywhere, are not as efficient as they sound. The metros are spread far and wide, the taxi often drops you in inhabited areas far from your objectives, and different elevators connect each level of the ecology rather than just one central elevator. It's worth noting that the fast travel times are already quite long on current-gen consoles at 20 seconds or so, but these might be insufferable on last-gen consoles where significantly longer times have been reported. If there's one positive to all the time you'll be spending travelling across these massive environments, it's that you'll often do so with your jaw on the floor. Now nothing is perfect, and the Ascent has some issues with floaty animations, erratic physics objects, NPC reactions, and inconsistent levels of environmental distraction. But these only rarely detract from an otherwise impeccable presentation. The isometric viewpoint, coupled with the developer-controlled camera, have allowed Neon Giant to create a world that feels alive, packed with an incredible amount of fine detail and moving parts, and it's also one that runs at a high resolution and near perfect 60 frames per second on the current generation consoles. Once you emerge from the subterranean deep stink, the sheer scale of every location is overwhelming. The world is densely layered, with an incredible level of fine detail stretching far into the distance. The map scale is actually difficult to interpret at times, and waypoints are a pain to find without using the ping system, as areas often exist both above and below you. It's a cold, brutal, and neon-soaked world, but you can't help but admire its beauty. The environments are also teeming with NPCs, so good luck avoiding collateral damage in firefights, and the Ascent also uses a dense layer of ambient sounds to ensure it feels even more lifelike. The voice work is decent, and every moment, cutscene, exploration, or combat, is enhanced further thanks to a moody and, when necessary, thumping cyberpunk soundtrack. I just wish the gameplay mechanics could have been as diverse and compelling as the environments. So many of these stunning locations simply serve as a backdrop for the follow-the-waypoint style missions and increasingly samey combat. While I appreciate the Ascent comes from a small 12-person team, it feels like far too much time was spent developing the world, and far too little time was spent ensuring there were interesting things to do in it. I often found myself exploring empty areas, packed with incidental details, and struggling to imagine what an environmental artist would feel like if they discovered this was all used for just some random firefight. That said, if you've got an Xbox Game Pass subscription, or you're happy to take the risk given it's half the price of a AAA title, the world of the Ascent is worth exploring, even if just for a little while, and preferably with a few friends.